Hey there, I'm Shamitria, the Rowdy Math teacher. I'm sharing this video with you today to demonstrate how I use data to create a data-driven math review. When I designed this content, I was really thinking about those of you who are preparing for those massive statewide assessments like we do here in Texas, or even a summative semester exam. However, this process could be used for a chapter test, a classroom test, or even a district common assessment. Over the years, I've worked with a number of teachers who would just take all of the content that's going to be on an upcoming test or exam and use that for their review. And while I'm certainly guilty of that myself, it's not the most effective or efficient way to prepare for an exam because some of the content your students are already doing really well with. So you may not need to review that with the entire class. You may not need to review it with the class at all. It may be a small select group of students that you need to review with, but that's something that we can determine by using data to drive our review. That's the purpose of today's video, and that's the process that I'm going to share with you. So with that, let's dive right in. First, you'll need to collect some data on how your students are doing on your state or district standards. One of the easiest ways to do that is to use a previously released version of a test that you can administer to your class, maybe in one setting or over 2 days, and get that data back to show how students performed on each question. Now I know that not everybody has that access. Even here in Texas, I've worked in districts where the district did not want you to use a previously released version of the test because they were repurposing that data in some other way. So maybe they were pushing that out as part of their review, or they used it throughout the year as part of the district curriculum, but it wasn't accessible to us in the classroom. So if you're in that situation, you have a couple of options. First, you could compile your own version of the state test. So you might pull questions from different places, making sure that you hit all the standards, and then just put together your own assessment that you could then administer in one sitting or administer over a day, 2 or 3. You could also kind of use a spiral review approach. Take some spiral review sheets. Maybe you've got, here in Texas, 5th grade's got about 36 standards. So I might put together a sheet that has 6 standards, and I go through those with students over 6 days. So it wouldn't take as long on one day for me to get it done, but maybe I give students 30 to 45 minutes to complete those 6 items, and then at the end of the week I take all of those pages and put them together kind of as my assessment material so that I can create my data spreadsheet. Once you've collected all of your information from students about their performance levels, I want to create some type of document. Now you may be fortunate enough where you're in a place where you've got like a machine that will accept a Scantron with the answers coded, and it will spit out a document for you that gives you the question number or the standard number, and it tells you the percentage of students that responded to that question correctly. That's an ideal situation, but I know not everybody has that. So there's a couple of ways then that you could collect your own information. So personally, I like to grade my tests by hand. So as I'm grading, I may just have a little chart next to me where I can just tally how many students got the questions right or wrong. And honestly, I probably would tally how many students got the questions wrong because it makes the math a little easier in the end. I'm hoping I've done an excellent job as a teacher and not that many students are getting the questions wrong. So it's a lot less work on me to just tally the number wrong. So once I'm finished grading all the tests, then I can just take the number of students who answered it incorrectly, subtract that from the number of students I have in my class to get the number of students that answered it correctly, and then take that number, create a fraction over the total number of responses, divide the numerator by the denominator, and then multiply times 100 to get a percent. So as you can see here on my screen, I have all of my standards listed here in the left-hand column. That's their identifier. And then in the center column, I have a description that's just directly from our state material about what that standard is covering. And then here in the last column, I have a percentage that shows the percentage of my students that answered the question correctly. So all I've done here is just set up that spreadsheet with all of my data so it's nice and neat in one place. And again, some of you may have access to a machine that will spit this out for you. Those are fabulous, but if you don't have that, you can easily create something that you can work with here, like on a Google Sheets spreadsheet or on an Excel spreadsheet. All right, next step is to color code our data. So this is the fun part for me. I like colors, so it's fun to get to color code all of my data and see all the different colors on the page. Although actually I don't really want to see all the different colors on the page. I only want to see my yellow, green, and blue, but we do know that of course we're going to have some red and orange. So as you can see here on my screen, I have my key, and any question or any standard where less than 50% of my students responded to that particular question or standard correctly, I'm going to code that red. So I'm just going to shade that red. Sometimes if I've got a printout, I'll just use a highlighter. So this is of course a more fancy way to do things, but you can certainly just use a highlighter or colored pencil to mark your standards. And then next, any question or standard where 50 to 70% of my students responded correctly, I'm going to color that orange. And then my next level is yellow. So anything that's 70% to 80%, that's going to be yellow. And then green, 80% to 90%. And then finally blue is going to be anything above 90%. And if you want to finish the rainbow, of course, you could add purple. And so if you've got some things that were 100% correct, yay, those things can be coded purple. The next screen that you're seeing here is actually the example of me coding all of my data. So as I kind of scroll here, you can see that I've used my key to color code each of the standards. And just kind of taking a look through, you can see I've got some orange and red here, and that's something that I'm going to need to address in my final step. But I do have also some blue and some green as well, and that always makes me happy to see. All right, so one of the benefits to using an online tool or computer-based tool is that you've got that sort feature. So I was actually able to sort my spreadsheet. Here, the percentage column, I sorted it here from highest to lowest. That way I could get the colors in chunks, and not only does it make it a little easier to see where everything fits, but it also is a little prettier to look at than the previous screen where all the colors were mixed up all over the place. So here I can easily see that I have two standards in the blue. I've got about 9 or 10 standards here in the green. I've got 6 standards here in yellow, and I've got a chunk of standards here in orange. And so this is what I'm going to talk about in the next little piece here. And then I've got 5 standards that are in red. Okay, so this gives me a place to work from. And now I'm actually going to create my plan. So if I kind of scroll back up here to the top, you can see I've actually got my actions listed here next to the key. So we'll start with the red at the bottom. So anything that is red, I'm just going to reteach it to the whole class. If less than 50% of my students were able to respond correctly to a particular question or to a standard, that's a red flag for me, which hence is why it's red. So I'm going to do a whole class reteach for that. And I'm also going to review the question type. Oftentimes, the problem isn't with the particular standard, it's with the question type, and that's something that I need to know. So I'm first going to look at the question type and see, is there anything about that question that might have tripped the students up? Or were the distractors so good that students had a hard time kind of weeding through and analyzing that question? If that's the case, where I feel like the question type or the question format is more the problem than the standard, then I'm going to pull out one of my other review tools. So I may use that question in a who's correct or who's thinking correct format, where we can analyze that question and the answer choices as a class. In fact, that's a really great way to review a question where the distractors or the answer choices were problematic for students, or where there were, when I say distractors, I mean answer choices that had common errors or kind of revealed common misconceptions for students. Sometimes that's all that's needed, is just for us to review it. Otherwise, I am going to go ahead and just plan out a new lesson for that particular standard so I can reteach the content. Okay, so my next group then is orange. And you can see I've got a large group of orange here, which is actually okay because this becomes my math station content. So I'm going to start picking apart those standards, and I'm going to start pulling materials that I can use to create station rotations around this content. Now, you'll notice here that I have a little box around the bottom of the orange section. And if you look at my percentages, these are the lowest of my orange. So what I'm going to do with these particular standards, and I just picked the things that were less than 55%. So I'm not going to have time most likely to do a reteach of all of this content. So another strategy that I can use to reteach this content is through stations. So these 4 standards would be what I would do at my teacher station. And I'm just going to go ahead and plan a quick 15 to 20 minute reteach lesson that I can do through stations, and I would make sure that the whole class went through that station, because if we're performing this poorly, it looks like everybody could probably use a review of that content. So I'm going to use these 4 stations as teacher stations where I work with all of the students in a small group, and then the rest of these orange standards will become station baskets. So I'll look for games and materials that I can use to have the students review that content. Next up is the yellow section, and that's going to be where I'm going to push these questions and these standards through my spiral review. So whatever spiral review program or system I'm using, I'm going to make sure that I filter in a bunch of these questions in that time. So if I'm using kind of a pre-made system, I want to go through that system and be sure that I'm using pages or using materials that go through these particular standards, that these standards are included in that spiral review. So that's how I'm going to address that. And then moving up a little bit more, I've got my green section, which I'm happy to see the green and the blue, but I still need to do some work. So I still have some students who are answering these questions incorrectly. So these are going to be small group check-ins. And this might be something that I do where I pull a small group at a different time of day and just focus in on some of these questions and these standards. It's most likely that some of the same students are missing these same questions, and so I could probably do multiple standards with the same group of students, or maybe cover multiple things in one day or in one sitting. Then finally, I have my blue standards. Typically, I'm going to just almost really leave them alone. I'm excited about those. I feel like I probably have just 1 or 2 students that are missing those, and I'm just going to do individual conferences. To be honest, I probably did a conference with those students while I was grading, noticing that, hey, this was a pretty simple question and they should have been able to get this right, but I have Susie over here who wasn't able to get it right. So I probably already called Susie up and said, hey, Susie, I want you to look at this. Take another look at this with me and let's figure out what went wrong. Because I probably have already addressed it, but if I haven't addressed it, I'm going to do some individual conferences to go over that blue material. Now, the only thing that's left for me to do is to gather my station materials. That's really the biggest task in this whole process. So for me, really anything can be a station material. I love to use card and dice games, previously used games and activities, and online resources like IXL Math. And I will say, one of the things I love about using things that the students are familiar with is that they're familiar with it. One of the biggest challenges with using stations is time that it takes the students to get going on the station. So using something the students are familiar with means that I can put it in the bucket, they can pull it out, and get started immediately. There's not a lot of time wasted with instructions. One other little tip that I have for you is to use IXL Math. It's an online resource. They have a plethora of standards. Some of them are correlated to our state standards, but you can go through that website and have students assigned to do some of their work there. You're getting them on a computer. It's online. It automatically creates some engagement for them, right? Even though they're still practicing. So just another little tip for you. IXL does some free accounts for teachers, like a 30-day trial. So you can set up one of those 30-day trials right around your test time, and you should be assigned enough accounts for your students. I think it's about 30, which for most of us I think would be enough accounts for our class. So you can assign each one of your students an account, and they can use that account for the 30 days. So I typically will do that right around review time. That way I can plug in some of the IXL math content into my stations, and then that's just another way to keep my students engaged. So the biggest deal for me, as I'm sure many of you know from the things I write about on my blog, is engagement. I want my students to be engaged, and I want to keep them learning. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, or you can always post a question on my Facebook page. And here's wishing you a rock star review season. Bye.